The capture of Arya. The galaxy was vast and unpredictable, full of wonders and dangers that no one could have predicted. Arya, a young alien from the peaceful planet of Thaler, had always lived a life of simplicity, bound by her community's traditions and the gentle embrace of her family. But that was before the war, before her planet was attacked, and before everything she knew came crashing down around her. Thaler had never been a target for the Kyriths. The Kyriths were a ruthless, expansionist alien race known for their brutality and a terrifyingly efficient military. They had conquered countless planets and enslaved many species along the way, but Thaler had always remained out of their reach, until now. It all began with the arrival of the Kyrith fleet. Arya and her people had heard of their conquests, but it had never seemed real until the night the Kyrith ships appeared in the skies above their once peaceful city. Panic spread like wildfire. Her family, along with many others, scrambled to hide in the subterranean shelters, but no amount of hiding could protect them from the relentless advance of the Kyriths. They came in droves, taking prisoners, forcing the inhabitants into labor, and imposing their will without mercy. Arya had been one of the unlucky ones. She was captured while trying to protect her younger brother, Zen, who had been too terrified to run. They separated them immediately, taking Zen to an unknown location while Arya was loaded onto a transport ship with other prisoners. She had no idea where they were taking them, but she knew it wouldn't be good. The ship's interior was dim, lit by flickering lights, and its walls hummed with the sound of machinery. The air was thick, the temperature uncomfortable, and the prisoners were shackled to the cold metal seats. Arya tried to focus on the stars visible through the small window, but they offered no comfort. Her thoughts were clouded with fear, not just for herself, but for her people, her home, and her family. What had the Kyriths planned for them? "Don't look out there," a voice beside her whispered. Arya turned to see a tall, gaunt alien with silver skin and hollow eyes. The alien's voice was barely audible over the hum of the ship. "It only reminds you of what you've lost." "Where are we going?" Arya whispered back, her throat dry. The alien shook his head slowly. "We've been sold, all of us, to the highest bidder." Arya's blood ran cold at the words. Sold? She had heard rumors, dark whispers about the Kyrith's practices. They captured alien species and sold them as slaves, treating them as nothing more than commodities. But she hadn't believed it. Now she was living the nightmare. The ship continued its journey through space, but Arya could not sleep. She stayed awake, her mind racing with thoughts of escape, thoughts of her brother. She didn't know where they were taking him, but she knew she had to find him. She couldn't just let him disappear into the unknown as she was about to. There had to be a way out. Hours passed, maybe even days, before the ship finally landed on a desolate planet, one with no signs of life or habitation, an industrial wasteland. The prisoners were unloaded and herded into a large, open square where they were lined up like cattle. Arya stood frozen as she took in the sights around her. Everything was bleak. The air was thick with dust, and the distant hum of machinery seemed to seep into her bones. Her gaze drifted to the center of the square, where a large stage had been set up. A handful of Kyrith officers, tall and menacing, stood overseeing the area, and behind them were cages filled with other prisoners, some of whom were already in chains. The realization hit her with a gut-wrenching clarity. This was an auction. One of the Kyrith officers, a towering figure with an intricate armor design, stepped forward and addressed the group of prisoners. "These are your new masters," he said in a cold, unfeeling voice. "You are now property. Those who survive this process will be taken to a new life. Those who do not will be discarded." The prisoners were stripped of their identities, given numbers, and forced into pens like livestock. Arya was dragged into a cage of her own, the steel bars closing behind her with a final, ominous clang. Her hands were shackled, and she was left with only her thoughts and the bitter, oppressive air of the slave camp. She sat in silence, her heart heavy with fear for her brother, wondering if he had already been sold. Would she ever see him again? The thought felt like a weight too great to bear. As she sat, trying to process her new reality, a sudden commotion broke out in the distance. A series of ships had landed, each carrying figures cloaked in darkness. They were the buyers, the rich, powerful individuals who owned worlds, who could afford to purchase lives like hers. The Kyriths began shouting orders, and the auction began. The first to be sold was a frail, young alien, barely older than Arya's age. The bidders called out prices, throwing credits like they were nothing. Arya felt sick to her stomach as she watched the young girl be led away, her fate sealed. Then it was her turn. A Kyrith officer approached Arya's cage, and she stood with as much dignity as she could muster. They unlocked the cage and dragged her forward, forcing her to stand before the auctioneer. The cold eyes of the bidders scanned her as they called out in different languages, their words unfamiliar and cruel. But it wasn't the words that chilled her, it was the look in their eyes. Arya's heart pounded as the auctioneer held up his hand, signaling the start of her bid. The crowd murmured as the price began to rise, each bid more jarring than the last. She wanted to scream to fight back, but her body was too weak from the journey, and her mind was consumed with fear. But then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the bidding, a human voice. The crowd fell silent as the voice spoke again. "I'll take her." The bidding stopped abruptly. The other bidders stared at the human, their expressions filled with disdain. No one expected a human to intervene, least of all someone as seemingly insignificant as this one. But this human was not like the others. This human was different. And with that, Arya's fate took a turn she had never imagined. The human who dared to defy. The silence in the auction hall stretched for what felt like an eternity. Arya stood frozen in the middle of the stage, her body trembling, her heart hammering in her chest. She had never expected to be in such a situation, let alone be bought by a human. The humans were supposed to be far below the Kyriths in power, not part of the elite class that could afford slaves like her. Yet there he was, the man who had dared to intervene. His appearance was striking, not because he was exceptionally tall or handsome, but because he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed to demand attention. His features were sharp, his dark hair slightly messy as if he had been through his own battles. His clothes were simple but of a quality that signified he was not a mere wanderer. His eyes, however, were what caught Arya's attention the most, intense, unwavering, and filled with something that she couldn't quite place. It was a look that held no judgment, only curiosity and perhaps even compassion. The auctioneer, a tall Kyrith with glowing red eyes, raised a brow at the human's interruption. "You wish to purchase the alien?" he asked in a mocking tone. "She is not a mere servant, human, she is." "I don't care what she is," the human interrupted, his voice low but resolute. "I'll take her, name your price." The Kyriths exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to respond. It was rare for a human to have enough credits to buy a slave, and even rarer for a human to purchase a female alien. Slaves like Arya were usually sold to powerful elites, not ordinary citizens. But the human didn't back down, staring the auctioneer down as if daring him to challenge his offer. After a tense pause, the auctioneer reluctantly gestured to his assistant, who began typing on a terminal. The numbers flickered on a holographic screen as they calculated the price. 100,000 credits, the auctioneer announced, his voice cold and businesslike. "Take her or leave her." The human didn't hesitate. "Done," he said, tossing a small device toward the auctioneer. The transaction was complete in an instant. Arya stood motionless, not fully understanding what had just happened. The chains around her wrists were unlocked, and the Kyriths roughly shoved her toward the human. For a moment, she felt nothing but terror. What kind of human would buy her? What would he want with her? Would he treat her any differently than the Kyriths had? "Come with me," the human said, his voice softer now but still commanding. The way he spoke to her didn't sound like the usual command of a slave owner, and it confused her even more. Arya hesitated for a moment, looking over her shoulder at the auction stage she had just been sold on. This was it. The price had been paid, and she had no choice but to follow this stranger into whatever fate awaited her. As she walked beside him, she couldn't help but glance up at his face. He was looking straight ahead, his jaw set with determination, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made her feel slightly safer. They didn't speak as they left the auction hall, but Arya noticed how people parted ways for the human, their gazes filled with disdain. It wasn't just because he had bought her. It was because humans were seen as lower beings in this galaxy, the Kyriths especially considering them to be weak and insignificant. To the Kyriths, humans were barely worth the effort of enslaving, and yet this one had defied expectations and purchased an alien slave. They reached a small transport vessel that looked nothing like the grand ships of the Kyriths. It was modest, practical, with no frills or luxurious touches. The inside was surprisingly clean and well-kept, with a few simple seats and a small console at the front. Arya stood at the threshold, uncertain whether she should enter or not. The human turned to her. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, as though reading her mind. "Come aboard, I'll explain everything." Arya didn't know whether to trust him. She had been told to never trust anyone, especially humans. But something in his voice made her feel a flicker of hope, a flicker she hadn't felt since her planet had been destroyed. Reluctantly, she stepped inside the ship. The door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss, and the engine hummed to life as the human took a seat at the console. He seemed to be focused on navigating the ship, but Arya could still feel his presence, like a shadow looming over her. She wasn't sure if it was comforting or unnerving. Once they were in the air, cruising through the black void of space, the human spoke again, his voice breaking the silence. "My name, Caleb," he said, offering a hand, though Arya didn't take it. "I know you have questions. I'll answer them, but first I need to know who you are." Arya looked at him warily, unsure how much to reveal. She had always been taught to hide her true identity, to keep her true nature a secret, but something in Caleb's eyes, something kind, made her hesitate. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she found herself wanting to trust someone. "I'm Arya," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm from Thaler. My people were taken by the Kyriths." "I know," Caleb said, his tone gentle. "I've heard of what they did. I'm sorry." Arya swallowed the lump in her throat. "Why did you buy me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What do you want with me?" Caleb's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the control panel. "I didn't buy you to own you, Arya. I bought you because I can't stand seeing people like you suffer, and the Kyriths, they have no right to treat anyone this way." Arya blinked, confused. "But you're human, you can't be serious." "I am serious," Caleb replied firmly. "I've spent my life trying to fight against systems like the Kyriths. I've seen too much pain, too much cruelty. I couldn't just stand by and let this happen." His words were unexpected, and Arya found herself lost for a moment, unable to process what he was saying. Could it be true? Could a human really care about her plight, about her people? As the ship sailed through the endless expanse of space, Arya felt a sense of uncertainty, but also a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who would help her, someone who would fight back against the Kyriths. She didn't know what Caleb's intentions were, but for the first time since her capture, she felt like she had a chance. But she knew that this was only the beginning. Caleb might have bought her freedom, but the true fight had only just begun. Arya didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to find out. The path to freedom. Days passed as Caleb and Arya traveled through the vast reaches of space, heading toward a destination neither of them had fully planned. Caleb's ship, though small and modest, was equipped with the essentials, providing just enough comfort to make the journey bearable for both of them. During this time, they spoke often, Caleb sharing stories of Earth and its diverse cultures, while Arya revealed more about her home planet Thaler and the Kyriths who had destroyed it. Arya's sense of unease slowly began to fade, replaced by a cautious trust in Caleb. It was clear that he was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He was no mere human. He was a person driven by ideals, someone who saw injustice and felt compelled to act. Their destination was a secretive colony on the edge of known space, a haven for those who had escaped the Kyrith's oppression. It was a risky journey, but Caleb was confident that it would provide them both with the safety and resources they needed to fight back. One evening, as they sat together in the small dining area of the ship, Caleb noticed that Arya seemed quieter than usual. Her gaze was distant, as though she were lost in thought. "Something on your mind?" Caleb asked gently, noticing her change in demeanor. Arya shifted in her seat, pulling her knees up to her chest as she looked at him. "I keep thinking about what you said, that you bought me because you wanted to help," she said, her voice hesitant. "I don't understand. Most humans don't care about people like me. We're just commodities to them. So why me?" Caleb studied her for a moment, then leaned forward, his expression serious. "Because I can't stand to see people suffer, especially when they don't have a choice. You didn't ask to be enslaved, and you certainly didn't deserve to be sold like that. I know I can't undo what the Kyriths did to you, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again." Arya's eyes softened, but the wariness in her heart remained. She had lived too long under the shadow of betrayal to trust easily. "And you really think you can change things? The Kyriths are powerful. No one dares to stand against them." "I know," Caleb said, his voice firm with conviction. "But there are others like me, and there's always a way. You just have to be willing to fight." Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to imagine such a world where people like her weren't oppressed, a world where she wasn't a slave. But could it really happen? Could Caleb and the people he spoke of actually defeat the Kyriths? Her thoughts were interrupted when the ship's console beeped, signaling an incoming message. Caleb quickly stood and walked over to the terminal, his fingers flying over the controls. After a few moments, the holographic image of a woman appeared before them. "Caleb," the woman said, her voice calm yet urgent, "it's good to see you're still alive." Caleb's expression softened at the sight of her. "Rhea, it's been too long. How are things on your end?" Rhea's face darkened slightly. "We're managing," she said. "But the Kyriths are tightening their grip on this sector. I've managed to get some intel, but we need to act soon if we're going to get you two into the safe zone." Arya stood up from her seat, drawn to the conversation despite her wariness of this new person. "Safe zone?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" Rhea's hologram flickered slightly as she shifted her position. "We have a network of resistance cells across the galaxy, hidden from the Kyrith's watchful eyes. It's a place where refugees like you can find safety and support. But we need to be cautious. The Kyriths are always watching, always hunting." Caleb nodded. "We're ready, we'll follow your lead." The connection cut out just as abruptly as it had begun, and Caleb turned to face Arya. "Rhea's one of the leaders of the resistance. She's been working on gathering intel and resources to free people from the Kyriths. We're heading to the safe zone now, but it's going to be dangerous." Arya absorbed this new information with mixed feelings. A safe zone, a place where she could be free, the thought was almost too much for her to process. But with it came a sobering realization. They weren't just running from the Kyriths anymore. They were about to fight. "I've never fought before," Arya admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how." Caleb smiled, though it was tinged with sadness. "You don't have to fight right away. We'll teach you. It's not just about combat. It's about survival, strategy, and protecting what matters. You've already fought in ways you don't even realize. You survived, Arya. That's more than enough to start." She met his gaze, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. Could she really do this? Could she really fight back against the Kyriths? "I'll learn," she said, more to herself than to Caleb. "I want to be free. I want to fight for it." Caleb gave a short nod, "And we will." Later that evening, as the ship sailed through the vastness of space, Arya sat by the window, staring at the stars. The Kyriths had taken so much from her. Her family, her planet, her freedom. But she was not the same girl who had been sold into slavery. She was different now. She was not alone. She had Caleb, and she had a chance. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. The safe zone and the cost of freedom. The journey was far from over, and every passing day seemed to stretch longer than the last. Caleb and Arya grew closer as they traveled through the stars, their bond of trust solidifying with each shared meal, each conversation, and each silent moment spent in each other's company. The ship was small, but the time they spent together allowed Arya to see Caleb in a new light. He wasn't just a human who had bought her freedom. He was her partner now, someone who believed in the possibility of change and who would risk everything to see it happen. It was a daunting thought, but one she couldn't push away. For the first time, Arya felt something she hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging. Caleb's ship, the Windbreaker, slipped through the outer edges of known space like a shadow. They were almost to the safe zone, a secluded area known as Nexus 7. The Resistance had set up a hidden outpost there, and it was known only to a select few. Caleb trusted Rhea, but even he knew that their arrival would mark the beginning of something much larger than either of them had imagined. As the ship approached the edge of Nexus 7's atmosphere, Caleb's fingers worked quickly over the console, coordinating their descent with practiced ease. "Are we ready?" Arya asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she didn't want it to show. Caleb looked at her and nodded, his expression firm but reassuring. "This is it. The hard part's almost over." Arya's heart raced. She had no idea what to expect, but the thought of finally being free from the Kyriths and from the chains of her past felt like a weight lifting off her chest. Yet there was a quiet, gnawing fear inside her. This was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would require them to fight, to stand up against the Kyriths in ways they hadn't even planned for. They weren't just running anymore. They were entering the heart of the Resistance, where danger was always close, and failure could cost them everything. The ship touched down gently on the surface of Nexus 7, hidden from the eyes of the Kyriths and anyone else who might be watching. The landscape was a striking contrast to the barren, oppressive environments Arya had grown used to. Here, the air was fresh, and the land was full of life, forests dotted with strange, bioluminescent plants and animals that seemed almost too fantastical to exist. "This is where the resistance hides," Caleb said, his voice low. "We'll meet Rhea and the others. Get some rest. You're going to need it." Arya stepped out of the ship, her boots touching the soft, uneven ground. For the first time in a long time, she felt the earth beneath her feet, and for the first time since the day the Kyriths had come to Thaler, she felt like she could breathe again. They made their way toward the hidden entrance of the Resistance's base, a small cluster of buildings camouflaged by the forest and protected by a network of encrypted signals. As they approached, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with short, dark hair and sharp eyes. Rhea. "Welcome," Rhea said, her voice calm but carrying an air of authority. "We've been expecting you." Caleb nodded and gave her a brief but respectful smile. "Glad to be here." Rhea turned her attention to Arya, her gaze softening. "You must be the one Caleb's been telling us about," she said, her eyes scanning Arya's face with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You've been through a lot." Arya hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't remember much of who I was before everything happened." She glanced at Caleb, who gave her an encouraging nod. "But I know I want to fight. I can't keep running." Rhea's expression changed to one of understanding. "You're not alone here, Arya. We fight for more than just survival. We fight for freedom, for the ones who can't fight back." The resistance base was small but well organized. As they moved through the facility, Arya saw men and women of all races, all kinds of people from across the galaxy who had found refuge in this remote outpost. She could see the pain and hardship in their eyes, but there was also a spark of something: hope. Later that night, they gathered in a large, dimly lit room, where Rhea and Caleb explained the Resistance's mission in greater detail. They were working to gather information about the Kyrith's plans and to disrupt their operations whenever possible. But their ultimate goal was to overthrow the Kyrith's reign, to bring justice to those they had oppressed, and to free the enslaved people scattered across the galaxy. Arya listened closely, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never imagined a world like this, where people fought not just for survival, but for something much greater. It was a world where her pain could be transformed into a weapon, where she could finally take control of her own fate. As the meeting ended, Arya and Caleb stepped out into the cool night air. They stood together, gazing up at the stars, a quiet sense of camaraderie between them. "I didn't think it would feel like this," Arya said softly, her eyes reflecting the light of the distant stars. This is what it's like to be free." Caleb smiled, his eyes warm. "It's a start." But even as Arya allowed herself to hope for the first time in years, she couldn't shake the feeling that the true battle was just beginning. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a future. The next day, the mission would begin in earnest. But for now, Arya took solace in the knowledge that she had a choice. She wasn't a slave anymore. She was a fighter. And she would never go back. The final stand for freedom. The morning at Nexus 7 was unlike anything Arya had ever experienced. There were no harsh orders barked at her, no chains rattling as she moved, no cruel eyes watching her every step. Instead, there was a quiet hum of unity, resistance fighters preparing for the day, engineers fine-tuning ships, strategists huddling over holomaps. For the first time in years, she was surrounded by people who saw her as an equal, not as property. But the peace was short-lived. Caleb and Rhea had spent the night reviewing intelligence reports. The Kyriths were moving faster than expected, sending ships to raid settlements where they suspected the resistance was hiding. Worse, they had put a bounty on Arya. "They know you escaped," Rhea said, her expression grim as she leaned against the metal table in the war room. "And they're looking for you." Arya's breath caught in her throat. How did they find out so fast? "They must have realized the ship that rescued you wasn't destroyed," Caleb muttered. "We might have left a trace when we jumped to hyperspace, if they've tracked us here." "They haven't," Rhea cut in. "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time." She turned to Arya, her gaze sharp yet understanding. "The Kyriths don't take humiliation lightly. You're a symbol now, proof that their control can be broken. That makes you dangerous." Arya swallowed hard. The idea of being hunted sent a chill down her spine, but at the same time, something inside her burned hotter than fear. The Kyriths wanted her to run, to be afraid, but she had spent too much of her life running. "I won't hide," she said, her voice firm. "I want to fight." Caleb's gaze flicked to hers, a mix of admiration and concern in his eyes. "Then you'll need to train fast." Training for the fight. The next few days were a blur. Caleb taught her how to fire a blaster with precision, how to disarm an enemy in close combat, and how to anticipate attacks before they happened. She trained with resistance soldiers, sparred with other former captives who had turned into warriors. Every muscle ached, every breath burned, but she didn't stop. She wasn't just training to survive, she was training to win. One night, after hours of grueling drills, Arya and Caleb sat side by side near the base's perimeter, watching the stars. "Why are you doing this?" Arya asked, suddenly turning to him. "Why risk everything for someone like me?" Caleb sighed, running a hand through his short hair. "Because I know what it's like to feel powerless," he admitted. "I grew up under the Kyrith's rule too. My family fought against them, my parents. They didn't make it." Arya felt a pang of sorrow. "I'm sorry." He shook his head. "That's why I fight, because someone has to stand up to them, and because no one deserves to live in chains." Arya stared at him, seeing the weight of loss in his eyes. He had saved her, but in a way she realized she was saving him too. The Kyriths strike back. The attack came without warning. Alarms blared through Nexus 7 as explosions shook the ground. Kyrith ships descended from the sky, weapons blazing, soldiers storming the base. They had been found. Arya grabbed her blaster, her heart pounding. This was it. Rhea's voice crackled over the comms. "All fighters hold the perimeter, evacuate the civilians." Caleb ran to Arya's side. "Stay close to me." But Arya wasn't about to cower behind anyone. She charged into battle, dodging plasma fire, taking down Kyrith soldiers with every shot. The fear that had once paralyzed her was gone. Now there was only purpose. The fight was brutal. Resistance members fell, but they fought back with everything they had. Ships exploded in the sky, the ground scorched with energy blasts. The Kyriths had underestimated them. Arya spotted the Kyrith commander, a towering reptilian figure in black armor, leading the charge. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward him. He sneered when he saw her. "You should have stayed in your cage, girl." Arya raised her blaster. "I'm not in a cage anymore." They fought blow for blow, strength against speed. The commander was powerful, but Arya was relentless. She ducked under his attacks, striking fast, dodging, never giving him a chance to regain control. Then, with a final, desperate move, she grabbed a fallen soldier's knife and drove it straight through the commander's armor. He staggered, eyes wide in shock, before collapsing. The tide of battle shifted. Without their leader, the Kyriths panicked. The resistance pushed harder, driving them back, forcing them to retreat. By sunrise, it was over. A new beginning. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and victory. Arya stood amidst the wreckage, her hands shaking from adrenaline. She had done it. Caleb approached her, his face bruised but victorious. "You okay?" She looked at him, then at the rising sun. "I'm free," she whispered. The resistance had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Kyriths would come back, and next time they'd be angrier. But now Arya wasn't afraid. She was ready. She turned to Caleb, a fierce determination in her eyes. "What's next?" He grinned. "Whatever we want." And for the first time in her life, Arya knew that was true. The end.